Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Our episode today is Alternative Approaches to Brain and Mood Wellness. It's a lot of fun making these for you, and my desire for this one was to kind of have a cozy discussion about what are the alternative methods that are available for those of you that haven't heard it. Many of you that have heard me talk already know this stuff, and I just wanted to put one together for your family members so that you could share kind of a quick synopsis of what are some of the things that are available. Now, these are not things that are validated in the drug sense. They're not been vetted through the processes of all the different, FDA requirements to be called diagnosis, treatment, cure, or prevention of a mental health disorder or disease. Psychologists, rightly so, would push back and say these are not recognized treatments for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and all these different mental health disorders. But I have to tell you that since, I went to school 30 years ago to be a chiropractor, it's been written about that only about 15% of medical interventions have any basis in science. So most of what clinicians do are based on mechanisms that are known and not completely and entirely validated. They aren't mechanisms that have been handed down as a trade, essentially, just like a plumber or an electrician hands down techniques that work. And there are certain things that are studied, and that's why doctors are given licenses, because there isn't a perfect knowledge. There isn't a perfect knowledge of what to do. So we're given a license to do something that might harm someone. And we don't generally harm people, but we do sometimes harm people, and that happens. And it's understood, and it's not called malpractice. It's just an oops. And sometimes it's a well-intended. Most of the time, it's a well-intended oops. And most of the time, people aren't damaged. They just don't get better, or they get a little worse and then they recover. And in some rare cases, they're impaired. Now, I think that drugs and surgery are a lot more permanently damaging than, say, natural alternative approaches, even though alternative approaches may be shown at some point to be fraudulent or that may be ineffective or not do the job they claim to do. However, at least they will do no harm, which was the first rule of Hippocrates. So my desire here is to just quickly summarize these things, what they are and how they work, and just put them all in one place for you in one little package. So I'm going to go to my next slide. The first of these is QEEG and neurofeedback. Now, QEEG, you've heard me talk about before if you pay attention to this channel. It's a quantitative electroencephalography, and it means taking pictures essentially of the squiggly lines of the brain waves. So you're measuring with a cap the brain waves as they come out of the skull, and you're capturing them in real time and looking at them and seeing, are they normal? Now, you have to understand, normal for a doctor is different than normal for the public. Normal for a doctor is, do they have a disease or not? And so if they don't have a disease, there's a wide swathe of what could be normal and a lot of variation. However, there is a much more narrow definition of what is ideal and healthy. And of course, that takes into consideration the exceptions of people that are exceptional, that have super abilities or superpowers, if you will. And there certainly is some range for that. But very generally, there's a way of looking at QEEG that professionals do to show what does the normal resting state of the brain look like. And that is, what does the brain look like for about 10 minutes of eyes closed and about 10 minutes of eyes open measurements. And that will tell us that somebody's got an imbalance somewhere. There's too much of something or too little of something somewhere. And it's not enough to be called a disease. And it's not enough to trigger a third-party reimbursement from, say, Medicare or from insurance companies. But it is often very desirable to help a person function better. And so that's called functional medicine or functional neurology, functional psychology, functional psychiatry. And unfortunately, that name has been usurped by the psychiatry profession to mean they use it in a different way. We use it in alternative medicine and chiropractic. We use functional medicine to be restoring function and measuring dysfunction, and as opposed to pathology. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The psychiatrists, the professional groups, tend to use the word functional neurological disorder to mean that it's all in your head, and there's something that's really what they used to call a conversion disorder, which is where you take an emotion and you convert it into a physical neurological symptom. That's not at all what I mean. So I just want to clarify that. So QEEG is measurements. It's like an X-ray. It's like a blood pressure cuff. It's a device that measures something to help you figure out what's wrong. And it doesn't diagnose you if there's nothing that's diseased. It won't diagnose that there's something wrong. It'll analyze and assist in the assessment that there's something wrong, but it doesn't tell you that there's a pathology. And certainly EEG can tell you if there's a pathology, but to just throw away every finding that's normal and say that person is done is really not very useful. There's a lot of wonderfully useful imbalances that are within the normal range where a neurologist or an epileptologist or a psychiatrist would look at the EEG and say, that's medically normal. Go away. You don't need any drugs or surgery. But we in alternative medicine would find all kinds of gems of imbalances in there that we could tweak and work on and help you get better. And we could use nutrition, and we could use hyperbaric oxygen. We could use neurofeedback, which again, on this same slide is neurofeedback, which is a method of treatment. It's not an assessment, it's a method of treatment. And so it's very similar in that there's often a cap on your head or electrodes on your head, just like this person here. And that is a way of measuring the brain waves. And then the computer will detect the brain waves, and it will measure if you're getting closer to the desired brain waves and reward you with some kind of light or sound or movie or song or something that plays on the screen. And when that happens, you get the joyful experience that something is happening in the moment that you like. And it's almost like when your phone makes little noises and flashes at you, and you get a tiny little hit of dopamine. Every single time you get these rewards, you get a little bit of dopamine, a little bit of dopamine, a little bit of dopamine. And so those breadcrumbs of dopamine build a capacity for you to make more and more and more of those desired brainwaves if we program the computer right to reward you properly, and if it's fast enough of a reward. So we just wanted to mention that. What is another thing that is important in mental health besides, counseling and drugs and sometimes surgeries for the brain? Well, the next slide that we'll talk about here is lab testing. So lab testing is where we test for the metabolism of neurological markers that have to do with the brain. And other times we test for things that aren't directly related to the brain, but are indirectly related to the brain that might affect other parts of your body more directly, like kidney markers that might mark damage of the kidneys, or other markers in, say, the heart, or markers of the liver, markers of bile, all kinds of stuff. So there's those things. So we can look at all these different labs, and some of them will be blood, like you're used to, where they draw a little bit of blood from your arm, or it might be a stool test or a hair test for heavy metals, or it might be a urine test. There's a bunch of urine tests out there that can very much help us have ideas about what might be stressing out a person's brain. And then we can fix them without directly counseling them through, say, their depression. We might be able to help their depression or their anxiety or their OCD or their PTSD through changing their body chemistry and rebalancing that. We call that an organic brain dysfunction. When there's something wrong with somebody's brain that isn't a pathology necessarily, or maybe sometimes it isn't something that's in your head and caused by emotional processing and thinking and decisions and trauma. It's more about the chemistry of what's circulating in your body. Much like if you have diabetes, your brain's going to be more inflamed than if you don't. And so that would contribute to, but not necessarily be causative of, a person's depression. And so we believe in natural medicine that removing those barriers is really important to establishing homeostasis and getting the brain back to normal naturally, so that you don't have to shove it with drugs, because we don't think that it's always the best thing to use patented, modern, dangerous drugs on mental health disorders at the first go. Our next slide is the Elimination Diet book that I've written, and it's on my website, humanconditionlab.com. You can go there and you can book a call with me. You can also have a free download of this book. It's an ebook that I wrote and put together of many other sources online of ways of quickly understanding what are all the different elimination diets, because elimination diets have to do with how your gut works and how your brain works. And we've got another lecture coming up on that very topic. But the idea is that this book will help guide a person through all the different kinds of elimination diets that are out there. Maybe not every one of them, but most of them, because there's a whole bunch. And we found that there are a lot of people who don't do well with just one elimination. Like they just reduce lectins and they discover that, oh man, I also needed to reduce salicylates. And maybe I also needed to reduce sulfur, or I needed to reduce cruciferous vegetables. I needed to reduce fibers of certain kinds. I needed to reduce isothiocyanates or phytates, and not every list is the best list for you if it's eliminating one particular thing, because you might need to eliminate more than one thing to feel better. So in reading about what are the common eliminations that we make out of the chemicals that are in food, you can learn how to say, wow, I should try this kind of elimination diet and get myself better, because a lot of these they don't require antibodies to cause problems. So you can't do an antibody test and say, oh, I don't have any antibodies for that lectin or that fiber or that food or that phytate. But you will have anti-nutrient effects and toxic effects and inflammatory effects without any antibody reaction. So just looking for like a Cyrex test or an antibody test or a food allergen test, it's a great thing to do. Don't misunderstand me. But if you do that and you get a negative, it doesn't mean that you're clear and you're okay to eat whatever the heck you want, because you might very well have a legitimate reaction in your gut that affects your brain that is related to food and has nothing to do with antibodies. So that's our elimination diet. Please go and you give your email and you get the ebook instantly. No fee, no cost. Perhaps my favorite method of helping people began with studies of children that had seizure disorders and epilepsy. And I got such good results by getting better and better and better at keto and carnivore diets that it became something that we used for other things. And it wasn't just me. There's a whole load of doctors that really want to use keto and carnivore for nearly every mental health disorder. Everything that happens to the brain does really, really well with keto and carnivore diets, except for certain people that have some hypoglycemia. And we can manage that with some other methods. But generally, we found that the rules of chemistry that say that keto diets are beneficial for seizure disorders are extended by a couple of things. They aren't just keto diets, they're carnivore diets too, because that tends to be a keto type diet. And it reduces lectins, it increases nutrients, it reduces anti-nutrients, it helps with absorption of nutrients and healing of the leaky gut. And it also helps with a bunch of different conditions. It helps with depression, anxiety, bipolar, because the mechanisms of the cells inside the brain are all really the same. The general idea is we want to decrease oxidative stress. We want to increase efficient burning of fuel. We want to increase nutrient absorption. We want to decrease lectin binding. We want to decrease inflammation. And all of those things are achieved with this kind of diet. I will say that there are a number of people that need to go through a lectin cleanse first. And there's another group of people that also, on top of that, may need to do a bile and gallbladder support, liver and pancreas support for weeks and weeks, maybe a few months, before they can tolerate meat and fat because they've been deconditioned. They're not capable of secreting the bile and the stomach acid to be able to digest such larger amounts of these fats and proteins that are animal-based and that are very complex and difficult to tear apart because they've been eating plant-based diets a long time, and they sometimes don't do so well for a couple of reasons. One is because the plant-based diets have less nutrients than the animal ones. Number two, because there are anti-nutrients in the plants. Number three, because there are lectins that can cause inflammation in the gut and the organs, and that can also stop, or not stop, but bind to the organs of the digestive system, like the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, the small intestine, the stomach, the large intestine, and cause a reduction of secretion of digestive juices and reduce motility and cause inflammation in the gut. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But we've also found that many doctors don't do keto or carnivore right, and they run into the keto flu, or they run into a bunch of symptoms, or they think they're doing it right and they don't get the person to improve, or they can't get them into ketosis and keep them into ketosis. They have real problems understanding that you've got to know about omega-6 and 3 fats. You've got to not do dirty keto for some people. You've got to really not give them a lot of plant lectins. You've got to reduce plant lectins quite a bit, and there are some keto diets that don't do that. In many cases, you have to really stay below 25 grams of carbs a day, depending on how serious your brain problem is. And other people can be a lot less strict on their diets. They can be carnivore-ish. They can have fruit and honey, and they don't need to be ketogenic, and they don't need to have ketones in their blood. Another mistake people make is they check urine ketones instead of blood ketones. And that really doesn't work after the first day. It's not reliable and it's too variable. And another thing that people do that I see an awful lot is they think they've got to push themselves into ketosis so greatly that they suffer and they go into starvation. And really, we need to stay below about 3 units, 3 units of ketones, about 0.8 to or 1.0 to 3.0 is really the only range we need to stay in. We don't need to go crazy with this and be so aggressive. There's another thing that comes up with the keto diets that people fear, which is they say, what if I start making ketones? My doctor will take me off the diet. Well, if you're between 1 and 3 ketone units in your blood, that's perfectly safe. You enter a starvation range after 3, and you enter ketoacidosis at about 10. So if you're at 1 to 3, you're not in danger. And it's really silly to tell somebody that they shouldn't have ketones in their blood if it's 1 to 3. That's very healthy. But if it's above 3, if it's in the 3-4 range, then we're in the starvation range where you have some inefficiencies going on, and we have the real danger range at above 10. So that can be a little different for children sometimes. It can be a little different for type 1 and type 2 diabetics, but certainly we really shouldn't be scaring people, even diabetics, into saying that you can't be in metabolic ketosis if you're 1 to 3 units. HRV, or heart rate variability, is a really interesting mechanism that is a bit complicated, but it can be measured fairly easy these days with a thumb meter or a finger meter, sometimes a meter around your chest or your rib cage. There are people that have measured the heart rate variability, and this is a measure of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is something that measures the parasympathetic nervous system and allows you to measure just how efficient your heart rates are. Because while we want the heart to be regular and rhythmic and not have arrhythmia or dysrhythmia, we do want it to have the slightest bit of not exact perfect timing. We want it to have the slightest bit of its own rhythm. We don't want it to be like a metronome that has a certain speed and it's always at that same speed. It turns out that the more absolutely robotically regular, like a metronome, your heart is, the more sympathetic dominant you are, and the less parasympathetic dominant you are, and the less regulated by a healthy nervous system you are. So what we want is this formula, and there's a bunch of formulas we're not going to go into today, that calculate different numbers about the heart rate variability, which is the span between peak and peak, or trough and trough, from those waves, those QRST waves that we see in the EKG, which is the heart rhythm. You can see that there on the slide. If you look real close on the computer screen there, you'll see that there's these little blips. And when you measure the distance between the heartbeats, those distances should get a little bit wider and a little bit shorter each time, each heartbeat. They shouldn't be exactly on rhythm like a metronome. That's not arrhythmia or dysrhythmia. It's just biologically alive. It means that you've got variability, you've got the ability to change and adapt to a circumstance. You're not rigidly running a very stress-based rhythmic heart rate. And so by training and breathing your body, you can learn how to get your heart rate variability back to healthy. And even you can integrate this with your EEG and your brain waves and your adrenals and your adrenal output. Your sleep will be better. It's really quite a very interesting thing. I think it's really important for us to know that that's a way of helping people. And since I talked about breathing, let's go to our next slide, where I'm talking about Wim Hof breathing. Now, Wim Hof is just a famous, wonderful human being who I've studied and haven't gotten a chance to meet yet, but I've absolutely enjoyed the writings and the methods that he's really brought to the public based on his own trauma. He lost his wife. And when she died, he really was just devastated. And so, we won't get into his whole story, but essentially he learned to breathe and meditate and control his autonomic nervous system and his brain. And he was able to help people learn how to turn their breathing into a way that controls their brain and can calm them down or rev them up. And in fact, one of the things that seems a little bit counterintuitive, since I was just talking about heart rate variability, is that sometimes the nervous system needs to be more sympathetic, not less. It needs to have more sympathetic output. And by more sympathetic, I don't mean, oh, I'm sympathizing with you. I mean sympathetic as in the fight or flight response, or the blood vessel dilation response, which is to be alerted and aware and awake and a good state of arousal so that your body can respond to stress. Sometimes our bodies are not too sympathetic. They're not enough sympathetic, and they need to be more. And so Wim Hof helps us understand that in the moment that we're, say, outside in the cold, or that we're dealing with something, like metabolic problems or cancers or other things, it might be very good for us to go into these sympathetic modes through breathing and exhalation and blowing off carbon dioxide. And I will mention that you want to be careful not to do this method with deep sea diving or with snorkeling and holding your breath diving, because some weird things can happen. So don't mix this with diving unless you're being trained by some very highly trained people, because it can cause some real problems if you're trying to learn how to hold your breath and dive down. So we're not talking about that, but really for so many other things, this is incredibly important for helping the brain get better, and helped him get better without medication and surgery and frontal lobotomy and all those things that are done to people when they have intractable problems. So please know that that's something that really does work. And I'm telling you as a clinician, I've used these methods on thousands of people over 30 years, and it's really very helpful. I can't tell you how important good sleep and recreation is to be able to have time to relax and time to do nothing. You need to have time where you're scheduled to be not scheduled. You need to have time where you can sleep and take a nap. You need to have time where you can go recreate and do things by yourself or with other people or with family members or away from family members, depending on how you're doing and how your family's doing. It's very nice to be able to have that recreation, and it's not something that's not nice to have. It's truly necessary. Our brains really need that break, and we need to have downtime. So making sure that we have good sleep and recreation. And this gets me off on a side point that is my little axe to grind, which is that you can't have good sleep and recreation if you don't have enough financial security and understanding that you're taken care of. And so in our culture today, we have to address inflation, we have to address monetary policy, we have to address taxation, we have to address all those things to make sure that people can truly make a life for themselves and not feel like it's all just getting sucked away from them. So that's where government politics and monetary policy meets mental health. And I think it's truly extremely very important. Well, one of my favorite things in life has been supplementation. Now, you can certainly do without supplements if you had a very healthy diet where you're eating a lot of animal products and maybe some plant products. I don't know. I'm more of an animal guy than plants generally, but I do use a lot of plant medicines, and I have used a lot of plant medicines. So the idea that you can get access, at least in the United States, to a lot of supplements is good. In the United States and in Europe, they continually try to chip away at our rights to have supplements and to regulate them and to control them and limit our access to them or make them more expensive or tax them. And I think it's really important to know that you need to fight for that freedom to have the ability to buy your own supplements on the market without a prescription and be able to do things for yourself and detoxify yourself. This breaks you free from the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And I've just listed a few here for you. I've got grass-fed beef organ meat complex, which is something that I like to use with my patients a lot. I also use Paul Saladino's version, which is a beef organ meats from Heart and Soil brand. I've got an activated charcoal here for detoxification of heavy metals and other things, alpha lipoic acid for detoxification of heavy metals, glucosamine sulfate for binding to lectins like dairy and gluten proteins. I've got magnesium, which is important for just everything. It's responsible for about 80% of the biochemical processes in your body are related to magnesium. It helps with bowel movement, it helps with nerve conduction, it helps with energy. Ashwagandha is an herb that is used to help regulate the adrenal glands and to some degree the reproductive system, but mostly the adrenal glands. Turmeric is my favorite anti-inflammatory. I know Paul Saladino doesn't love turmeric, but when you're trying to get healthy, it's a transition. And some people just can't go full bore carnivore. And even Paul doesn't go full bore carnivore. He uses some fruit and honey, and I'm fine with that for a lot of applications. But there are people that are going to need a mixture of approaches. And I would like to see people nudge toward carnivore, nudge toward keto, because, with today's lives, you're busy. You're parents, you've got kids, you've got jobs, you're busy. So you can't necessarily dive in and screw yourself up and mess up your digestion. You got to go slow. You got to try stuff. And I'm okay with that. If somebody's really, really sick, we'll get them in a retreat type of environment where the environment is controlled, and I'm working with them, and we'll get them, very rapidly through all those different phases, and we'll dive in and attack whatever's going on if they're very sick. But usually they're not working, they're not at their job when they do that, because we're diving into their health because they've got something really bad that they need to work on very acutely. But for most of you that are out there working on something, you're not going to die anytime soon from it. So you can have time to slowly, work yourself into different supplements and different elimination diets, different trials of more animal foods, more protein, more fat, learning how to fix your gallbladder and do all those things. Bladderwrack kelp is a great source of iodine. It's also a great source of a binder for the blood type diet concepts. It's great for O blood types, and it helps to bind to lectins that would normally bind to the O blood type. Riboflavin is vitamin B2. We see it a lot in people with cracked lips and other types of problems. L-tryptophan, really useful for the production of neurotransmitters, and fish oil to help balance omega-3s. All of these are either directly related to brain function or peripherally related to some support that helps the brain function better. And in fact, psychologists are really taught not to diagnose somebody with a a mental health disorder in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they're taught not to diagnose somebody with a mental health problem or mental illness like depression or anxiety or bipolar until or unless they've already worked out that there's no organic brain dysfunction like thyroid disorder, diabetes, adrenal dysfunction, anemia. These are things that a functional medicine doctor would want to do, and that a counselor or psychologist would try to eliminate as much as they can. The field of detoxes and cleanses is kind of what I'm known for. So being able to know about all the different kinds of detoxes and cleanses for the different organs are useful. There's detoxes for the liver. There's detoxes for certain things in the liver. There's detoxes for aluminum in the brain. There's detoxes for fluoride in the joints and in the tissues. There are detoxes for lectins. There's detoxes for estrogen. There's all kinds of detoxes that a person can do. They can be organ-based, like the gallbladder. They can be substance-based, like glyphosate. Or estrogen. They can be heavy metal based or single metal based. There's all kinds of detoxes, and today is not the time to go through all of them. But detoxification of natural things in the world, like heavy metals that occur from volcanoes and from just naturally occurring, as well as industrially occurring, and man-made chemicals like glyphosate and other types of pesticides and herbicides, things like dry cleaning fluid, solvents and volatile organic compounds like paints and paint thinners. All those chemicals can be detected in the urine and detected in the body and figured out and then detoxified if we want to address them. And I found they affect autism. They affect they add together to affect autism. They add together to affect mental health dysfunction in adults. And even mold is a very powerful natural poison that is present in a lot of people that will really contribute to organic brain dysfunction and mess up your mental health. So there got to be these detoxes and cleanses for us to do. If we don't do them, we get into some real trouble. So what I really wanted to do today was just run you through some of the stuff that can give you a lot of hope. If you've had problems with mental health and you've worked with your counselor and you work with your psychiatrist, you might need to look at functional neurology, functional medicine, functional electrical brain work, which is neurofeedback. You need to look at lab tests in your diet. There's a lot of things that could be wrong that might contribute to you feeling better. And we just don't know until we look. And right now, our federal agencies aren't doing that, and our universities aren't doing that because of the profit motive and patents. And I think it's really important for us to figure out how to get more funding to study these things. And at home, you don't have to wait for a government agency. You can do it yourself, and you can figure out how to do these things by watching channels like this. Thank you.